Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. Today's main stories are the Louisiana Purchase and a look into a Supreme Court case that continues to shape U.S. law. I will be reading a lot from primary sources today, so prepare for a long episode. Welcome to 1803 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and it was tricky to find a notable event to kick this year off with. As returning listeners may have noticed, I always mention something from January 1st, and if nothing else, there's usually some new legislation going into effect, but apparently not in 1803. This caused me to do some digging, and I eventually found a letter sent to James Madison, so today we will open with that. I found the following story as a complete fluke, desperate to find some event worth mentioning from January 1st of 1803, but it's things like this that make it clear to me that I could absolutely spend every day for the rest of my life creating shows like this about interesting events from U.S. history and never run out of things to talk about. The nature of this show is to cover mainly the major events, putting them into a timeline as a celebration of our 250 years, but I really hope that you enjoy the show enough to allow me the opportunity to continue it in some form upon its completion in July of next year. Anyway, let's take it from the top. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and Samuel Snow, a merchant from Rhode Island, writes to the Secretary of State James Madison requesting some diplomacy to aid in his trade with China, saying, "The Chinese government has always been in the practice of desiring foreigners of every description to leave Canton after the season of business is over, generally ending in April, and retire to Macau, a Portuguese settlement, and return again to Canton generally in September. My agent has informed me that the new governor will not permit his residence at Macau unless permission is obtained from the court of Portugal. I beg leave, therefore, to request that you would be pleased to write to our minister at the court of Portugal and desire him to obtain permission for me to reside at Macau during the suspension of business at Canton. And as I expect to sail for China again early in the spring, I shall feel myself particularly obliged if a return could be had previous to my departure." The Rhode Island town of Providence, from which Snow hails, is in direct commercial contact with nearly everywhere on the globe, as Rhode Islanders are quite interested in Oriental goods, making it a lucrative opportunity for merchants. From China, these traders bring back tea, silks, cotton goods, porcelain, lacquered ware, cloves, and flannels, though each round trip generally takes up to a year and a half. This little side story that I found also led me to look into Samuel Snow himself, and there's not much information on him, but there is a portrait painted by an unknown Chinese painter, and in the portrait, he's wearing the Order of Cincinnati, which would indicate he served in the Revolution, so I did some more digging. In one edition of a magazine from 1966 called Rhode Island History, it says he received a commission as the 3rd Lieutenant of Artillery in the Rhode Island troops, and later attained the rank of captain in 1780, serving in the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, Continental Infantry. After the war, he and his brother began trading, and Snow was appointed the American Consul for Canton in May of '98, becoming the first ever truly resident American official in China. According to a museum in Rhode Island, Snow Street in downtown Providence marks the site of his house and derives its name from the trader who grew up there. Now, on to some national events. In his inaugural address, Jefferson stated his commitment to a rising nation spread over a wide and fruitful land, and he's already taking steps to expand the country he's currently the leader of. On January 11th, Jefferson appoints James Monroe to be the minister to France and Spain, instructing him to purchase New Orleans and East and West Florida. On the 18th, President Jefferson sends a confidential message to Congress seeking $2,500 to fund an expedition to explore the western lands. Even to Congress, Jefferson's motivations aren't fully explained, and I'm about to read the message, but pay attention to how many steps ahead he's planning already. As the continuance of the act for establishing trading houses with the Indian tribes will be under the consideration of the legislature at its present session, I think it my duty to communicate the views which have guided me in the execution of that act, in order that you may decide on the policy of continuing it in the present or any other form, or discontinue it altogether if that shall, on the whole, seem most for the public good. The Indian tribes residing within the limits of the United States have, for a considerable time, been growing more and more uneasy at the constant diminution of the territory they occupy, although affected by their own voluntary sales, and the policy has long been gaining strength with them of refusing absolutely all further sale on any conditions, insomuch that at this time it hazards their friendship and excites dangerous jealousies and perturbations in their mind to make any overture for the purchase of the smallest portions of their land. A very few tribes only are not yet obstinately in these dispositions. In order peaceably to counteract this policy of theirs and to provide an extension of territory which the rapid increase of our numbers will call for, two measures are deemed expedient. First, to encourage them to abandon hunting, to apply to the raising stock, to agriculture, and domestic manufacture, and thereby prove to themselves that less land and labor will maintain them in this better than in their former mode of living. The extensive forests necessary in the hunting life will then become useless, and they will see advantage in exchanging them for the means of improving their farms, and of increasing their domestic comforts. Secondly, to multiply trading houses among them, and place within their reach those things which will contribute more to their domestic comfort than the possession of extensive but uncultivated wilds. Experience and reflection will develop to them the wisdom of exchanging what they can spare and what we want for what we can spare and they want, in leading them to agriculture, to manufactures, and civilization, in bringing together their and our settlements, and in preparing them ultimately to participate in the benefits of our governments. I trust and believe we are acting for their greatest good. At these trading houses we have pursued the principles of the Act of Congress which directs that the commerce shall be carried on liberally, and requires only that the capital stock shall not be diminished. We consequently undersell private traders, foreign and domestic, drive them from the competition, and thus, with the good will of the Indians, rid ourselves of a description of men who are constantly endeavoring to excite in the Indian mind suspicions, fears, and irritations toward us. A letter now enclosed shows the effect of our competition on the operations of the traders, while the Indians, perceiving the advantage of purchasing from us, are soliciting generally our establishment of trading houses among them. In one quarter, this is particularly interesting. The legislature, reflecting on the late occurrences on the Mississippi, must be sensible how desirable it is to possess a respectable breadth of country on that river, from our southern limit to the Illinois at least, so that we may present as firm a front on that as on our eastern border. We possess what is below the Yazoo, and can probably acquire a certain breadth from the Illinois and Wabash to the Ohio, but between the Ohio and Yazoo, the country all belongs to the Chickasaws, the most friendly tribe within our limits, but the most decided against the alienation of lands. The portion of their country most important for us is exactly that which they do not inhabit. Their settlements are not on the Mississippi, but in the interior country. They have lately shown a desire to become agricultural, and this leads to the desire of buying implements and comforts. In the strengthening and gratifying of these wants, I see the only prospect of planting on the Mississippi itself, the means of its own safety. Duty has required me to submit these views to the judgment of the legislature, but as their disclosure might embarrass and defeat their effect, they are committed to the special confidence of the two houses. While the extension of the public commerce among the Indian tribes may deprive of that source of profit such of our citizens as are engaged in it, it might be worthy the attention of Congress in their care of individual as well as of the general interest to point in another direction the enterprise of these citizens as profitably for themselves and more usefully for the public. The river Missouri and the Indians inhabiting it are not as well known as is rendered desirable by their connection with the Mississippi, and consequently with us. It is, however, understood that the country on that river is inhabited by numerous tribes who furnish great supplies of furs and peltry to the trade of another nation, carried on in high latitude through an infinite number of portages and lakes, shut up by ice through a long season. The commerce on that line could bear no competition with that of the Missouri, traversing a moderate climate, offering, according to the best accounts, a continued navigation from its source and possibly with a single portage from the Western Ocean, and finding to the Atlantic a choice of channels through the Illinois or Wabash, the lakes and Hudson through the Ohio and Susquehanna, or Potomac or James rivers, and through the Tennessee and Savannah rivers. An intelligent officer with 10 or 12 chosen men fit for the enterprise and willing to undertake it, taken from our posts where they may be spared without inconvenience, might explore the whole line, even to the Western Ocean, have conferences with the natives on the subject of commercial intercourse, get admission among them for our traders as others are admitted, agree on the convenient deposits for an interchange of articles, and return with the information acquired in the course of 2 summers. Their arms and accoutrements, some instruments of observation, and light and cheap presents for the Indians would be all the apparatus they could carry, and with an expectation of a soldier's portion of land on their return, would constitute the whole expense. Their pay would be going on, whether here or there, while other civilized nations have encountered great expense to enlarge the boundaries of knowledge by undertaking voyages of discovery and for other literary purposes in various parts and directions, our nation seems to owe to the same object, as well as to its own interests, to explore this, the only line of easy communication across the continent, and so directly traversing our own part of it. The interests of commerce place the principal object within the constitutional powers and care of Congress, and that it should incidentally advance the geographical knowledge of our own continent cannot be but an additional gratification. The nation claiming the territory, regarding this as a literary pursuit, which is in the habit of permitting within its dominions, would not be disposed to view it with jealousy, even if the expiring state of its interests there do not render it a matter of indifference. The appropriation of $2,500 for the purpose of extending the external commerce of the United States, while understood and considered by the executive as giving the legislative sanction, would cover the undertaking from notice and prevent the obstructions which interested individuals might otherwise previously prepare in its way. Okay, so thank you for sticking with me through that reading. The exploration of the Western lands is going to be a continuing theme throughout this week, and we're going to start reading a lot of these primary sources in full to kind of paint the picture of this exploration. Everywhere that I've looked up that summarizes these events does so along very similar lines, but there's so much detail that I was missing and only found in reading these primary sources, so I've opted to include it as I imagine that you, the listener, is as interested in this topic as I am, which is why you're here. Jefferson's plan for an expedition meets the other part of today's story on January 30th, when James Monroe sails for Paris to join Robert Livingston to discuss and possibly buy New Orleans. Meanwhile, the French prefect, Pierre Clément de Loza, departs France as head of the advance party to Louisiana in order to prepare for the arrival of the Louisiana expedition's military forces. Back in the city of Washington on February 19th, Congress approves Ohio's statehood in accordance with President Jefferson's newly signed 1802 Enabling Act. But they forget one critical thing: ratification of the Ohio Constitution. Despite Ohio gaining here the title of the 17th state, it will be 150 years before the oversight is corrected and Congress technically completes all the steps constitutionally necessary for the creation of a state, though nothing practically changes as a result of this mistake. After this approval of Ohio's statehood, Congress approves Jefferson's plan for a Western exploratory expedition on the 22nd of February, and Jefferson taps his personal secretary Meriwether Lewis to lead the men who will search for the supposed Northwest Passage toward the Pacific. We ever so briefly mentioned Lewis' appointment to the role of secretary in 1801, but later this year he'll begin the journey he's remembered for. In regards to further payoffs to things that began in 1801, we'll now resolve a legal battle that began in that year due to the last-minute commissions Adams ordered for judges in D.C. On February 24th, the Supreme Court of the United States makes a landmark decision establishing the tenets of judicial review of both legislative and executive actions, and John Marshall, who was notably skeptical of Jefferson before he had officially become America's third president, writes the analysis. I'm no lawyer, so to ensure that I got the wording correct and presented clearly, I've paraphrased this section from the University of Minnesota's constitutional commentary on the case authored by Susan Lowe Block in 2001. Chief Justice John Marshall, writing for a unanimous court, divides his analysis into three parts. First, he holds that the petitioners are entitled to their commissions. Second, that the Secretary of State can be the subject of judicial process, including a writ of mandamus. Finally, he holds that a writ of mandamus is the appropriate remedy for the plaintiffs. But, says Marshall, the Supreme Court cannot constitutionally be given original jurisdiction to issue a writ of mandamus in this type of case. Because this case is not within one of the two areas of original jurisdiction specified by Article 3 of the Constitution, the court can only act as an appellate court in this matter. And because Section 13 of the Judiciary Act of 1789 purportedly confers on the Supreme Court original jurisdiction to issue writs of mandamus in this type of case, Section 13 is unconstitutional. The court then explains at length why it is justified in rendering ineffectual an act of Congress that it finds inconsistent with the Constitution. Finally, because it has no jurisdiction in this case, the Supreme Court denies the relief sought by Marbury and his colleagues. Only by asking the questions in the order used with jurisdiction last, and by creatively finding a conflict between Section 13 of the Judiciary Act and Article 3 of the Constitution, could Marshall assert the judicial power to review acts of both the legislative and the executive branches without ordering anyone to do anything, and thereby avoid a risk of defiance. This is, by any standards, a monumental opinion, far more important than the issue that inspires it. So, in the end, James Madison never delivers the disputed commissions, and at least 4 of Adams' appointments never serve in their commissioned role. But more importantly, the precedent is set that the Supreme Court has the authority to declare laws unconstitutional. Okay, now further setting the stage for the purchase of Louisiana, in March, Napoleon cancels the Louisiana expedition. On April 10th, he decides to sell Louisiana to secure funding for the ongoing wars in Europe, and the next day, he instructs his foreign minister and minister of the public treasury to inform Livingston and Monroe that he is willing to sell all of Louisiana. and the Americans gladly received the news, though reportedly to much surprise. Should probably pause here to acknowledge something that may be confusing to those unfamiliar with this chapter of American history. Louisiana, as we will be continuing to refer to it, does not share but one border with the modern state of Louisiana, that being the eastern border, drawn at the Mississippi River. The name, for now, refers to a much larger area, extending from the Mississippi in the east to the Rocky Mountains in the west, and from the Gulf of Mexico in the south to Canada in the north, technically beyond the current Canadian border. To skip ahead a little in order to further describe this area, as well as modern Louisiana, this land includes Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, Colorado, Indiana, South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, Minnesota, Nebraska, New Mexico, and Texas. For a map, as well as some more little details from this year, you can check out our X today or search 1803 on our page at 250 Years of USA if you were listening in the future. Now, back to our story. The United States and France agree on a Louisiana Purchase price of $15 million, which includes 2 conventions to the treaty that settles monetary disputes between the U.S. and France stemming from the recent quasi-war. The documents are formally signed on May 2nd of 1803, though as the area is largely untraversed, the exact size and terrain of this newly acquired land is unknown to the Americans. Meriwether Lewis writes to a man named William Clark, the brother of George Rogers Clark, who we've discussed in detail in relation to the northwestern frontier and his role in securing Vincennes and Kaskaskia, amongst other military exploits. Again, I could absolutely summarize, as many do when telling this story, or pick from a number of reliable history sources that effectively summarize the content of this letter, but as we'll spend the next 3 episodes reading directly from these men's journals on their journey, I don't see why I wouldn't just present the writings verbatim. You get so much color from the actual writings of people rather than interpretations and summaries that I find the only way to accurately write this show is to go through all these primary documents, and hopefully you'll enjoy as well. In this letter from June, Meriwether Lewis writes to William Clark on the planned expedition and outlines the time the journey is expected to take, as well as the goals wished to be accomplished, saying, "Herewith enclosed you will receive the papers belonging to your brother, General Clark, which sometime since you requested me to procure and forward to you. Pray excuse the delay which has taken place. It has really proceeded from causes which I could not control. From the long and uninterrupted friendship and confidence which has subsisted between us, I feel no hesitation in making to you the following communication under the fullest impression that it will be held by you inviolably secret until I see you, or you shall hear again from me. During the last session of Congress, a law passed in conformity to a private message of the President of the United States entitled, An Act Making an Appropriation for Extending the External Commerce of the United States. The object of this act, as understood by its framers, was to give the sanction of the government to exploring the interior of the continent of North America, or that part of it bordering on the Missouri and Columbia rivers. This enterprise has been confided to me by the President, and in consequence, since the beginning of March, I have been engaged in making the necessary preparations for the tour. These arrangements, being now nearly completed, I shall set out for Pittsburgh, the intended point of embarkation, about the last of this month, and as soon after as from the state of the water you can reasonably expect me, I shall be with you, say about the 10th of August. To aid me in this enterprise, I have the most ample and hearty support that the government can give in every possible shape. I am armed with the authority of the government of the United States for my protection, so far as its authority or influence extends, in addition to which, the further aid has been given me of liberal passports from the ministers both of France and England. I am instructed to select from any corps in the Army a number of non-commissioned officers and privates not exceeding 12 who may be disposed voluntarily to enter into this service, and am also authorized to engage any other men, not soldiers, that I may think useful in promoting the objects or success of this expedition. I am likewise furnished with letters of credit and authorized to draw on the government for any sum necessary for the comfort of myself or party. To all the persons engaged in this service, I am authorized to offer the following rewards by way of inducement. First, the bounty, if not a soldier, but in both cases 6 months' pay in advance. Secondly, to discharge them from the service if they wish it, immediately on their return from the expedition, giving them their arrears of pay, clothing, etc., and third, to secure to them a portion of the land equal to that given by the United States to the officers and soldiers who served in the Revolutionary Army. This is a short view of means with which I am entrusted to carry this plan of the government into effect. I will now give you a short sketch of my plan of operation. I shall embark at Pittsburgh with a party of recruits 8 or 9 in number, intended only to manage the boat, and are not calculated on as a permanent part of my detachment. When descending the Ohio, it shall be my duty by inquiry to find and engage some good hunters, stout, healthy, unmarried young men, accustomed to the woods, and capable of bearing bodily fatigue in a pretty considerable degree. Should any young men answering this description be found in your neighborhood, I would thank you to give information of them on my arrival at the Falls of the Ohio, and if possible, learn the probability of their engaging in this service. This may be done perhaps by holding out the idea that the direction of this expedition is up the Mississippi to its source, and thence to the Lake of the Woods, stating the probable period of absence at about 18 months. If they would engage themselves in a service of this description, there would be but little doubt that they would engage in the real design when it became necessary to make it known to them, which I should take care to do before I finally engaged them. The soldiers that will most probably answer this expedition best will be found in some of the companies stationed at Massac, Kaskaskia, and Illinois. Pardon this digression from the description of my plan. It is to descend the Ohio in a keeled boat of about 10 tons burthen, from Pittsburgh to its mouth, thence up the Mississippi to the mouth of the Missouri, and up that river as far as its navigation is practicable with a boat of this description. There to prepare canoes of bark or raw hides, and proceed to its source. And if any practicable pass over to the waters of the Columbia or Oregon River, and by descending it reach the Western Ocean. The mouth of this river lies about 140 miles south of Nakuta Sound, at which place there is considerable European trading establishment, and from which it will be easy to obtain a passage to the United States by way of the East Indies in some of the trading vessels that visit Nakuta Sound annually, provided it should be thought more expedient to do so than to return by the route I had pursued in my outward-bound journey. The present season being already so far advanced, I do not calculate on getting further than 200 or 300 miles up the Missouri before the commencement of the ensuing winter. At this point, wherever it may be, I shall make myself as comfortable as possible during the winter, and resume my journey as early in the spring as the ice will permit. Should nothing take place to defeat my progress altogether, I feel confident that my passage to the Western Ocean can be effected by the end of the next summer or the beginning of autumn. In order to subsist my party with some degree of comfort during the ensuing winter, I shall engage some French traders at Illinois to attend me to my wintering ground with a sufficient quantity of flour, pork, etc., to serve them plentifully during the winter, and thus be enabled to set out in the spring with a healthy and vigorous party. Permit me now to mention partially the objects which it has in view, or those which it is desirable to effect through its means, and then conclude this lengthy communication. You must know in the first place that very sanguine expectations are at this time formed by our government that the whole of the immense country watered by the Mississippi and its tributary streams, Missouri inclusive, will be the property of the United States in less than 12 months from this date. But here, let me again impress you with the necessity of keeping this matter a perfect secret. In such a state of things, therefore, as we have every reason to hope, you will readily conceive the importance to the United States of an early, friendly, and intimate acquaintance with the tribes that inhabit that country. That they should be early impressed with a just idea of the rising importance of the United States and of her friendly disposition towards them, as also her desire to become useful to them by furnishing them, through her citizens, with such articles by way of barter as may be desired by them, or useful to them. The other objects of this mission are scientific, and, of course, not less interesting to the United States than to the world generally. Such is the ascertaining by celestial observation the geography of the country through which I shall pass, the names of the nations who inhabit it, the extent and limits of their several possessions, their relation with other tribes and nations, their language, traditions, and monuments, their ordinary occupations in fishing, hunting, war, arts, and the implements for their food, clothing, and domestic accommodation, the diseases prevalent among them, and the remedies they use, the articles of commerce they may need or furnish, and to what extent, the soil and face of the country, its growth and vegetable productions, its animals, the mineral productions of every description, and, in short, to collect the best possible information relative to whatever the country may afford as a tribute to general science. My instruments for celestial observation are an excellent set, and my supply of Indian presents is sufficiently ample. Thus, my friend, you have so far as leisure will at this time permit me to give it to you, a summary view of the plan, the means and the objects of this expedition, if therefore there is anything under those circumstances in this enterprise which would induce you to participate with me in its fatigues, its dangers, and its honor. Believe me, there is no man on earth with whom I should feel equal pleasure in sharing them as with yourself. I make this communication to you with the approval of the President, who expresses an anxious wish that you would consent to join me in this enterprise. He has authorized me to say that in the event of your accepting this proposition, he will grant you a captain's commission which, of course, will entitle you to the pay and emoluments attached to that office, and will equally with myself entitle you to such portion of land as was granted to officers of similar rank for their revolutionary services. The commission with which he proposes to furnish you is not to be considered temporary but permanent if you wish it. Your situation, if joined with me in this mission, will, in all respects, be precisely such as my own. Pray write to me on this subject as early as possible, and direct to me at Pittsburgh. Should you feel disposed not to attach yourself to the party in an official character, and at the same time feel a disposition to accompany me as a friend any part of the way up the Missouri, I should be extremely happy in your company, and will furnish you with every aid for your return from any point you might wish it. With sincere and affectionate regard, your friend and humble servant, Meriwether Lewis. Clark quickly responds and agrees to take on the role of co-captain to the expedition, and the two men begin laying plans and securing men and supplies for the journey. But now, in a momentary detour, we will look into the life of Matthew Thornton, who was a signer of the Declaration and who passes away this month. Thornton was born in Lisburn, Ireland, but his family immigrated to America when he was only 3 years old. At the age of 26, he began what became a thriving medical practice in the Scottish-Irish town of Londonderry, New Hampshire, where he became distinguished both as a physician and a surgeon. In 1765, Thornton was prominent in the agitation against the Stamp Act in New Hampshire, but later held a commission as colonel of militia under Royal Governor Wentworth. In 75, Dr. Thornton denounced the unconstitutional and tyrannical acts of the British Parliament and was elected president of the New Hampshire Provincial Congress when Royal Governor Wentworth fled from the colony and boarded a British warship in Portsmouth. Thornton was also appointed chairman of the Provincial Committee of Safety, in charge of raising troops and arms for the cause. Upon taking office, Thornton issued a statement to the citizens of New Hampshire, and, in part, what he said was, "Friends and brethren, you must all be sensible that the affairs of America have, at length, come to a very affecting and alarming crisis. The horrors and distresses of a civil war which, till of late, we only had in contemplation, we now find ourselves obliged to realize. Painful beyond expression have been those scenes of blood and devastation which the barbarous cruelty of British troops has placed before our eyes. Duty to God, to ourselves, to posterity, ends forced by the cries of slaughtered innocents have urged us to take up arms in our own defense." The Dr. Thornton was president of the 5-man committee that drafted the first state constitution, and it was adopted on January 5th of 76, becoming the first U.S. state constitution, which we did read in our 76 episode. Dr. Thornton was chosen as a delegate to the Continental Congress and took his seat on the 4th of November in 1776. November, I hear you asking, yes. Although Thornton was not present during the debates on independence or when 50 of the delegates signed the Declaration on August 2nd, he became one of the 6 who did so in the following months, adding his signature to the same August 2nd engrossed copy that is the defining document of America's independence. Despite having no legal education, Thornton served as Chief Justice of the Court of Common Pleas, the Superior Court of New Hampshire, from 76 till 82. After serving in the Continental Congress for a little over a year, he left Congress and resumed his duties as an Associate Justice of the Superior Court. In his 70s, he served in the New Hampshire State Senate from 84 till 86. Thornton dies while visiting his daughter in Newburyport, Massachusetts on the 24th of June at the age of 89. On his gravestone is a simple inscription saying, quote, "An honest man." Now, on the 4th of July, the Louisiana Purchase is officially announced with the message, "The executive have received official information that a treaty was signed on the 30th of April between the Ministers Plenipotentiary and Extraordinary of the United States and Minister Plenipotentiary of the French government, by which the United States have obtained full right to and sovereignty over New Orleans and the whole of Louisiana, as Spain possessed the same." In light of this massive new land acquisition, President Jefferson calls for a special session of Congress to convene in October. He also provides Lewis with a letter of credit to aid him in his planned journey, which reads, "Dear Sir, in the journey which you are about to undertake for the discovery of the course and source of the Mississippi, and of the most convenient water communication from thence to the Pacific Ocean, your party being small, it is to be expected that you will encounter considerable dangers from the Indian inhabitants. Should you escape those dangers and reach the Pacific Ocean, you may find it imprudent to hazard a return the same way, and be forced to seek a passage round by sea in such vessels as you may find on the western coast. Your resource in that case can only be the credit of the United States, for which purpose I hereby authorize you to draw on the Secretaries of State, of the Treasury, of War, and of the Navy of the United States. I, Thomas Jefferson, President of the United States of America, have written this letter of general credit for you with my own hand, and signed it with my name." The journals of Lewis and Clark will serve to provide our story with updates over the next 3 years. And with any entries needing additional context, we'll present that as we continue. Because we're going to be cutting back and forth between journal entries and descriptions of the journey so much over the next couple episodes, I've decided to include a shorter audio cue, so it's just a single drum sound that will transition us back and forth. The journal's first entry finds us here on August 30th, when Lewis writes, "Left Pittsburgh this day at 11 o'clock with party of 11 hands, 7 of which are soldiers, a pilot, and 3 young men on trial, they having proposed to go with me throughout the voyage. Arrived at Bruno's Island 3 miles below, halted a few minutes, went on shore, and being invited on by some of the gentlemen present to try my air gun, which I had purchased, brought it on shore, charged it, and fired myself 7 times. 55 yards with pretty good success, after which, a Mr. Blaise Cenas, being unacquainted with the management of the gun, suffered her to discharge herself accidentally. The ball passed through the hat of a woman about 40 yards distance, cutting her temple, about the 1/4 of the diameter of the ball. She fell instantly, and the blood gushing from her temple. We were all in the greatest consternation. Supposed she was dead by in a minute she revived, to our inexpressible satisfaction. And by examination we found the wound by no means mortal or even dangerous. Called the hands aboard and proceeded to a ripple of McKee's Rock, where we were obliged to get out all hands and lift the boat over about 30 yards. The river is extremely low, said to be more so than it has been known for 4 years. The airgun that Lewis mentions here was instantly of interest to me, and it is in fact an airgun that shoots a small pellet upon the discharge of compressed air. It's a weapon that he'll use to impress Indian tribes and possibly, but unlikely, hunt small game with. On October the 2nd, we'll pause for a moment and remember a well-known signer of the Declaration, Samuel Adams. Of the men who signed the Declaration of Independence, few exercised a more powerful influence than Samuel Adams, and his life and actions are inextricably linked to this country's founding. Samuel Adams was born in Quincy, Massachusetts in 1722. Adams was a devout Puritan, and in 1736 he began his time at Harvard University, receiving a degree of Master's of Arts in 43. His thesis was entitled, "Whether it be lawful to resist the supreme magistrate, if the Commonwealth cannot be otherwise preserved." After the death of his parents in 49, he inherited a fine home and brewery. All of Adams' business ventures eventually failed, and he lost his entire inheritance. He even nearly lost his home several times, but through the generosity of family and friends was able to keep it. John Adams is his second cousin, and referred to him as a universal good character, unless it should be admitted that he is too attentive to the public and not enough to himself and his family. Now, in 1763, the British ministry proposed to tax the colonies for the purpose of raising revenue to be placed at the disposal of the crown. The colonies were alarmed, and in Massachusetts a committee was appointed. One of 5 delegates, Samuel Adams, wrote the first recorded public document that denied the supremacy of the British Parliament and their right to tax the colonies without their own consent, directly suggesting the necessity of a unified effort on the part of all the provinces. Adams wrote, "If our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands, and everything we possess or use? This, we conceive, annihilates our charter rights to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes at our British privileges, which, as we have never forfeited, we hold in common with our fellow subjects, who are natives of Britain. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape, without our having a legal representation, where they are laid, we are reduced from the character of free subjects to the state of tributary slaves. We, therefore, earnestly recommend it to you to use your utmost endeavors to obtain from the General Court all necessary advice and instruction to our agent at this most critical juncture. We also desire you to use your endeavors that the colonies, having the same interests and rights with us, may add their weight to that of this province, that by united application of all who are aggrieved, all may obtain redress. Now in 1770, the Boston Massacre became the first bloodshed between the British and the colonies. The next morning, a meeting of the citizens of Boston was called, and Samuel Adams rose and addressed the multitude. A committee was chosen to call on Governor Hutchinson with a request that the troops be immediately removed from the town. Adams strongly advised the governor of the danger of retaining the troops in the capital, and the governor wisely consented to remove the troops. In May of 73, Lord North's Tea Act was passed by Parliament. On November 5th, a committee of the Sons of Liberty met, and Adams declared anyone who aided in landing or selling tea to be an enemy of America. On November 28th, a ship arrived with tea on board. The next day, a meeting was held, and Adams declared that the tea shall be returned to the place from which it came. On December 16th, 7,000 people attended a meeting from 10 in the morning until 6 at night, more than filling the church in Boston in which they met. A messenger arrived with the refusal of Governor Hutchinson to send the tea back to England. So that night, 50 men dressed as Mohawk Indians went to the wharf and threw the cargo of the tea into the harbor. In 1774, Governor Gage sent Colonel Fenton to warn Adams that he had incurred the royal displeasure, and it was in the power of the governor to send him to England for trial on a charge of treason. It was suggested to Adams that a change in his political conduct might save him not only from disgrace, but also from the gallows. Adams replied, "Go tell Governor Gage that my peace has long since been made with the King of Kings, and the advance of Samuel Adams is to no longer insult the feelings of an already exasperated people." Governor Gage then issued a proclamation. "I do hereby in His Majesty's name offer and promise His most gracious pardon to all persons who shall forthwith lay down their arms and return to the duties of peaceable subjects, excepting only from the benefits of such pardon Samuel Adams and John Hancock, whose offenses are too flagitious a nature to admit of any other consideration but that of condign punishment." In a story familiar to most, Samuel Adams and John Hancock were being watched by the British, and British General Gage hoped to capture both on the night of April 18th of 1775. They were both staying at the home of Reverend Jonas Clark in Lexington when Paul Revere rode to warn them of the British approach to Lexington. Adams and Hancock quickly escaped into the darkness, and by dawn the British had arrived. Adams wrote in April of 1776, "I am perfectly satisfied of the necessity of a public and explicit declaration of independence. I cannot conceive what good reason can be assigned against it. Will it widen the breach? This would be a strange question after we have raised armies and fought battles with the British troops, set up an American navy, permitted the inhabitants of these colonies to fit out armed vessels, to capture the ships, etc. belonging to any of the inhabitants of Great Britain, declaring them the enemies of the United Colonies, and torn into shivers their acts of trade, by allowing commerce, subject to regulations to be made by ourselves, with the people of all countries except such as are subject to the British King. It cannot, after this, be imagined that we consider ourselves, or mean to be considered by others, in any other state than that of independence." Samuel Adams voted in favor of independence on July 2nd of 1776, and I'm sure he would have twice if able. And he signed the engrossed copy of the Declaration on August 2nd. Adams served on several important committees in Congress, notably the one that drafted the Articles of Confederation, which he went on to sign in November of 1777. He was a member of the convention to form a constitution for Massachusetts in 79 to 80 and was on the committee that drafted it. In 1781, Adams retired from Congress, but not from public life. He returned to Boston and served in the state Senate until he was elected lieutenant governor in 89, and he held that office until 94, after which time he was elected governor and annually re-elected until 97, when he finally retired from public office. Samuel Adams dies on October 2nd of this year at the age of 82. And although he lived nearly his entire life as a poor man, he has given an invaluable gift to the country he called home and will never be forgotten. On October 20th, the Senate ratifies the treaty with France, and on October 28th and 29th, the House of Representatives votes for the appropriations with which to carry the treaty and its conventions into effect. With legislation completed, it is signed by President Jefferson on November 10th of this year. A 12th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution is proposed by Congress on December 9th, reforming the way that the president is elected, and we'll cover this in more detail next year as we're already going long on this episode. Going back to the story of Lewis and Clark, the men that Lewis recruits to join him on the Exploratory mission west are called the Corps of Discovery. And for the next 2 episodes, we'll largely be telling the story of the Corps, with some updates of national importance coming in as they become relevant. Beginning in December, Camp Dubois houses the men of the newly formed Corps of Discovery, and these winter months are to be dedicated to final preparations for the long journey. The men that he has selected are a little gruff. They brawl and drink and disobey and frequently incur common military punishments such as lashes on the back or being forced to run the gauntlet. However, over the next few months, the men begin the slow process of becoming a corps, a unit. William Clark guides this transformation at the camp while Meriwether Lewis winters in St. Louis, securing provisions and consulting for traders' journals. Hard work teaches these men to rely on one another and prepares them for the long voyage ahead. Clark turns their mischief into skill, and the men hold shooting matches with local farmers to hone their marksmanship skills. Next year, we will begin with telling their story in earnest, but for now, we'll leave it there. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of our story. We are entering a phase of American history that I find fascinating. Exploration out west, the advancements in technology, all of that is what really inspired this show. There are countless podcasts that you could listen to cover some of the more notable military engagements. Definitely when it comes to the Civil War, Revolutionary War, World Wars, all the wars that America has been involved in, there's deep dive podcasts specifically for that. And so while I do touch on it and want to remain accurate when doing so, we're really starting to get to the part of the show that I was excited about. So I cannot wait to keep sharing the journey of Lewis and Clark with you tomorrow. Until then, you know the drill. Like and share the show with somebody that you know. Check out our X for photos from the day, and get in contact. It really does make my day to hear from y'all. This has been Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America, and as always, thanks for listening.